Caleb's Story, Chapter 5, Part 2 of Chapter 5. Papa was in the barn, but he wasn't cleaning the stalls. He was standing in the open doorway, looking out over the meadows and the slough filled with snow. He was also watching Grandfather walking down the road. Papa didn't answer me right away. The paddock gate needs fixing, he said, his voice soft. Papa, Cassie wonders... I stopped as Papa looked straight at me. Cassie wonders what, he repeated. I took a breath. Cassie wonders why you aren't happy to see your father, if you thought he was dead. Papa knew I was asking for me, too. Cassie's life is simple, Caleb. She thinks life is good and fair, and everyone does the right thing. We both watched Grandfather walk away down the road. But life is good and fair, I said, isn't it? Papa sighed. Sometimes, Caleb, but sometimes people do the wrong thing. Did Grandfather do the wrong thing? Papa winced at the name Grandfather. It did not come as easy for him as for Cassie. Papa looked at me again. You know, Caleb, you're almost as tall as I am. When did that happen? Papa turned and walked back into the barn and picked up his shovel. The gate, Caleb, he said, his voice soft. He bent over and began to clean out the stalls, his arms rising and falling in a regular rhythm. Up and down, up and down, up and down. I mended the gate and looked up once to see Grandfather far away in the west meadow. When I looked up again, he was gone. Later, when I went to the barn to put away the fence wire, Sarah and Papa were talking. They didn't see me, and I didn't mean to listen, but I was afraid to move. You should talk to John, said Sarah. Perhaps if you just talk about it. That's your way, Sarah, interrupted Papa. I thought it was our way, Jacob. Papa dropped his shovel and looked at Sarah. There is nothing to talk about. He walked away from us, Sarah. I was younger than Caleb. He walked away and left us to wait and wonder. Papa's voice got louder. Every day I looked down that road for him. Every day. Papa was shouting now. That shouldn't happen to a boy. That shouldn't happen to anyone. Sarah put her arms around Papa. He's old and tired, Jacob. Please talk to him. What does he want after all this time? Asked Papa. He could have written me a letter. Why didn't he write me a letter? Papa's voice sounded sad. Papa walked over to the barn door to look outside. He didn't see me in the shadows. I could forgive him for dying, but I will never forgive him for walking away, he said. Talk to him, whispered Sarah. I stood still as a stone. You can tell him he can stay until he's well enough to go, said Papa. You can tell him that yourself, Jacob, said Sarah. You are his son. She walked out of the barn, past Papa, past me. I stood quietly for a long time. Then, when I heard Papa begin to shovel hay again, I went out into the winter day. Dusk came, and it was colder. Sarah and Cassie and I set the table for supper. Papa came in at last. He looked around. Sarah shook her head. He hasn't come back from his walk. Papa looked out the window. Daylight was nearly gone. Papa washed his hands. Is supper ready? He asked. We can't eat without Grandfather, said Cassie. Papa dried his hands. He sat down at the table. We ate without him all these years, he said firmly. We can eat without him tonight. I'll go look for him, I said. Caleb, sit down. Papa's voice was sharp. I sat down. I think we should wait for him, Jacob, said Sarah. He's our guest. Papa stood up angrily. A guest? Of all things, he is not. The door opened and Papa stopped. Grandfather came in and took off his coat, then saw Papa standing. Sorry to be late, said Grandfather. I lost my way. It's been a long time. His voice trailed off. You should have eaten without me. That's what Papa said Cassie. Grandfather looked at Papa. Your Papa was right, Grandfather said. Grandfather sat at his place. Papa sat too. Grace, Caleb, said Sarah. Thank you for our food, I said, and thank you for friends who came to share it. That means you, Grandfather, said Cassie. I know, Cassie. said Grandfather softly. He turned to Papa. I see you cut down a stand of trees in the west meadow near the barn. Don't know if I would have done that. I fell out of one of those trees once, he said to me. Papa said nothing. Do you like children? Asked Cassie, staring at Grandfather. Grandfather took a spoonful of soup. Do you like children? Asked Cassie again. Sarah reached out her hand and put it on Cassie's arm to stop her talk. Don't know many, said Grandfather. Do you like the ones you know? No, said Grandfather. Cassie was surprised at Grandfather's answer. Her mouth fell open. But what about Papa? Asked Cassie. Did you like Papa when he was little? Cassie, eat, said Papa. But hush, said Sarah. Cassie was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Grandfather. You are not a nice man, she said. Now I told you that, said Grandfather. No one spoke for the rest of the meal. Even Cassie was quiet. Lottie and Nick watched us, waiting for talk. But there was no talk. Good night, Grandfather. I stood in the doorway of his bedroom. His oil lamp was burning. Grandfather stood by the window looking out. There's a moon, he said. I went over and saw the moonlight on the barn, the meadows, the road going to town. I watched a lot of moons from this room, said Grandfather. You must have missed the farm, I said. Grandfather was silent. You can read Anna's journals, I said. There, on the table, you can read all about the farm and all about us while you were gone. Grandfather didn't turn around. I picked up one of Anna's journals and opened it. I began to read to Grandfather. Papa married Sarah on a summer day. There were no clouds in the sky, and Papa picked Sarah up in his arms and whirled her around and around, her white dress and veil surrounding them like the summer wind. Caleb was so excited and happy, he burst into tears. Everybody was happy. There was silence, but Grandfather was looking at me. I did cry, I remember, I said, and I was happy. Good night, Caleb, he said finally. Close the door behind you. Just before I closed the door, Seal crept into Grandfather's room and jumped up onto his bed. An excerpt from Caleb's journal. Grandfather hasn't opened Anna's journals. He hasn't read mine. He doesn't talk to Papa. Only to Sarah, who makes him talk to her. Sometimes to Cassie and me. I'm glad Grandfather came, but I don't like the silence.